who is the man of many hats. He's a wealth of knowledge, and he is our solid ground land use and conservation specialist. Kip, are you with us?
I am, Nancy. Thank you very much. Sorry, my camera isn't working, but I see some folks that I recognize. Great to see you. And again, as Nancy mentioned, I'm part of the team here for solid ground training as the land use and conservation specialist. So I'll be able to provide some one-on-one consultations on soils, climate change adaptation strategies, finding and assessing farmland, and then helping assess some state and federal programs that may be useful to you, and certainly do a lot of referrals to Vivian and the NRCS offices. Also, I'll be doing some additional videos and modules on soil health and climate change adaptation and resilience. And this will have some field observations and links. So we hope to make these interesting and exciting. I would also encourage you, if you'd like to know more about soils, need a little bit more background about soils and climate change adaptation, check out my PowerPoints that I have on the website, the New Farms and Farmers website. There's a PowerPoint on soil health and management and one on climate change. So again, I'll be building on those with these videos and modules. Also, I just did 3 videos that are on the Connecticut Farm Risk Management site, and I don't know whether Becca or Nancy can put that in the chat, the website address. And the video, one is on estimating soil moisture by feel. Yes, you can certainly, get pieces of technology to help you estimate soil moisture and whether or not you need to irrigate, but you can also calibrate your fingers and your hand and your eyes to be able to know how much soil moisture is in the ground that's available to plants. So that's what that video is. I have one on soil compaction, which again, I think is very useful. It goes along well with this topic. And one to give you a basic idea of your soils on your property on using Web Soil Survey to identify your soils. So those are 3 new videos that I created that are posted on that website. And there'll be several more to come on the New Farmer and website for UConn. So thank you very much for coming tonight, and look forward to working with all of you. And awesome. I'll put my contact information in the chat.
Perfect. Kip, thank you so much for being here tonight. We really appreciate the plug with all the great work that you're doing, and definitely is very appropriate for sharing that tonight. So I will drop that Connecticut Farm Risk web address in the link after we get started. So without further ado, I'm thrilled to have Andrew Metford here with us as our feature speaker tonight. Andrew grew up, or actually he's coming in and zooming in from Maine tonight, which I think is pretty exciting to not have to travel in the winter. So it is one bonus of having Zoom. He grew up in Virginia and had many trips to his grandparents' farm in Pennsylvania as a youngster. And after going to school at Concordia University in Montreal, Quebec, he wanted to start his own farm in Pennsylvania. So he apprenticed at farms in 6 different states before starting his own in Pennsylvania. And then he eventually moved his farm to Maine before working at Johnny's Select Seed. He spent 7 years in the research department at Johnny's, traveling internationally to consult with researchers and farmers on the best practices in greenhouse growing. Andrew has been the editor and publisher of Growing for Market magazine since 2016, and he's the author of the Greenhouse and Hoop House Growers Handbook, as well as the Organic No-Till Farming Revolution. And he puts all the stuff he's learned to use at his own farm in Maine, One Drop Farm. So get your notebooks out and your pens and pencils, because we want you to soak up all the knowledge that you can tonight. So with confidence, you can adapt some of these skills and practices right at your own farms. Andrew, it's all yours. Oh, just so you know, we are going to do question and answers for about the last 15 minutes. So while we're going through the program tonight, if you can drop any of your questions in the chat, we'll be sure to feed those to Andrew towards the end.
Okay. There's this. I just shared my screen. Is that visible? All right, good. Great. Thanks everybody for zooming in tonight, whatever it's called. Yes, thanks, and thanks for the introduction, Nancy. This presentation is near and dear to my heart. No-till is something I've been interested in for a while now, and I look forward to talking about it with all of you. So we're going to talk about both. The way I think about this presentation is the whys of no-till and the hows of no-till. So we're going to spend roughly the first 40 minutes or so on the whys of no-till. So if you're already there and you're already extremely interested in no-till, maybe go grab a beverage or something, because the two main questions that I get on no-till are people who aren't already interested in no-till say, why would you ever want to stop tilling? And so I feel like it's important to address the whys a little bit before we get into the hows, in case there's people who are just interested. But then we're going to spend the following 40 or 45 minutes or so on how to actually do it. And once we establish why you would want to do such a thing, and then we'll try to have 10 or 15 minutes for questions at the end. So before we get started, I just want to say this is a judgment-free zone. Even though it's called no-till presentation, I figure, I've been told for a long time that tillage is bad. The less of it that you can do, the better. And so, of course, the least amount of tillage you could do is none. On the other hand, I know some people want to go straight cold turkey from tillage to just stop tilling. Some people want to transition gradually or just reduce tillage. I think, it's all good. I think, the way I think about it is the book that I wrote or the materials that we put out, if they can help people just till less, and maybe even get to tilling not at all, any of that it would do a lot of good for both farms and farmers everywhere. So please do put your questions in the chat. I know that there were some questions submitted. I did look them over. We'll try to get to some of those things and address them at the end. But if you have stuff that comes up over the course of the presentation, please do ask your question through the chat feature. And the last thing I want to say before we get started is just that I'm still learning about this stuff too. And you'll see learning about it is very much the process of writing this book. And so I'm actually working on another book about no-till, so my publisher for the first no-till book, New Society Publishers, I don't know, a little less than a year ago, they said, hey, would you write another one? I said, no. I said, I'm way too busy for that. And they said, no, we just want, how about we just do a really short one? Because sort of I think of it as like the quick and dirty of no-till, just for people it's almost like a quick start guide for no-till. And so they talked me into it. So I'm working on another book about no-till that's just supposed to be really practical, really short, and help people get started on no-till. I'm trying to do this collaborative project because what I've realized in the since I wrote the book and we have articles about no-till in the magazine, people will always say to us oh, well, how do you deal with bindweed in no-till? And I'm like, I don't know, because we don't have bindweed in Maine, and I didn't talk to anybody who had bindweed over the course of the book. And so I thought the best way, people have all these questions about no-till, some of which I have a suggestion for, and some of which I don't. So if you have any projects, I'm trying to get a farmer collaborative research project here. So if you have problems that you'd like to solve through no-till that you'd like to do a little experiment with on your farm, for example, I have somebody out in the Midwest who's going to see how long it takes to tarp a patch that's infested with bindweed to get rid of the bindweed. Email us at admin@growingformarket, or you can, if you go to growingformarket.com, there's places where you can contact us all over the place. I just wanted to reinforce, I'm still learning. if there are questions that the presentation leaves unanswered, please do get in touch, especially if you want to help us investigate them, because I'm gonna be doing some experiments on my farm this year, and if you have particular things that you might want to interest to explore yourself, we would love to talk with you about that. So without further ado, let's just move on here. Okay, so really quickly, I'm the editor of Growing for Market magazine. I've done it for the last 5 years, took it over from the original editor. This is actually our 30th year. So I took it over from the original editor, who was the founder, Lynn Basinski. You may know her. She wrote the book, The Flower Farmer. And so there's the magazine. We try to keep it really practical and be a good resource for market farmers, vegetables and flowers. If you're not familiar, if you go to the website growingformarket.com, right there on the homepage, you can request a free print or digital copy. So check it out. It's a great resource. And just a little bit about me, like Nancy said, I did not grow up on a farm. I grew up in suburban Virginia, but my grandparents had a farm. That got me interested in it. But I knew I wanted to farm, but I knew I didn't know how to farm. And so I moved around. I worked on farms in 6 states. I worked on farms in Pennsylvania, California, Washington State, Virginia, New York State, and Maine. And that's what ultimately brought us to Maine. It was very serendipitous. We just happened to move about half an hour away from the Johnny Selected Seeds research farm. So I worked at Johnny's in the research department for about 7 years, which led to writing that book, The Greenhouse and Hoop House Growers Handbook, which doesn't have anything to do with no-till, but no-till works great in greenhouses. So there you go. And basically that book came about because I would get all these questions about greenhouse growing from people. And I got the same questions over and over again. And finally, I was just like, somebody should write a book about this stuff. And so I did. Here's the book, came out in February 2019. And I feel like this book is really very much a survey. It's interviews with 17 different growers on how they do no-till on their own farm. I wanted to take the interview approach because I feel like there are as many ways to farm as there are farmers. There's no, one way to do no-till. And so as I saw, basically in this book, you can read about how all these different growers are doing no-till. And this is also a really good resource, Dirt to Soil. That's from 2018. It's a much larger scale. Most of the growers that I talked to were operating on a few acres. Dirt to Soil, the guy who wrote it, Gabe Brown, he's farming and ranching on a much larger scale. There have been a couple other books actually that have come out more recently. One by Brian O'Hara right there in Connecticut. And his book is called, I forget what it's called, but he has a book that in fact, he's one of the growers that I profiled in my book. And I'm so glad that he wrote a book because his farm is just amazing. His farm has all these systems that reinforce each other. And so his book really talks a lot about no-till, but he also has a lot of great systems going on his farm. So there are a lot more resources, and there are more books coming out all the time about no-till. So there are more and more resources if you're interested in no-till. So I just want to tell you really briefly about my own no-till journey, because I think it informs the story, and then we'll get on to the whys of no-till. Okay, so it's hard to believe, but so 15 years ago, I was apprenticing around on farms, and my wife and I, who apprenticed together, we called it doing the apprentice circuit, because we just basically moved around the country working on different farms. And so in 2004, we were working on a 100-acre organic vegetable farm out in Washington State, close to Seattle. And so I was just spending so much time, we were just spending so much time cultivating, right? Because the organic farm and had a lot of weeds. And so I think the farm owned 4 Alice Gs. If you know what an Alice G is, it's those little cultivating tractors. And so I think they had 3 that actually ran and 1 for parts. And so one of them was just constantly driving around the farm cultivating something. You know, it was like, just go cultivate something. And so, you know, the thing that got me into farming is the plants, right? I spent all my time learning about plants and farming and none of my time learning about mechanics and stuff like that. And I'm not a good mechanic. So I thought, you know, I don't want to spend my time driving tractors. I don't want to spend my time fixing tractors and machinery and stuff like that. I just want to deal with plants. And I thought there's got to be a better way than just tilling that, you know, just tilling and cultivating all the time. So, you know, the thing is in 2004, I was out there close to Seattle working on this farm, this big organic vegetable farm. And I had heard of no-till, but I didn't really even understand how that could possibly work, you know, because working on all the farms that I'd worked on at that point were very, very typical, what I think it was typical tillage farms as far as moldboard plowing, disking, probably some kind of a harrowing, then probably still some kind of rototilling and spading or something like that to get the beds ready. So with, you know, working on farms where 4 or 5 tillage passes were the norm, I was sort of like, how could you even, you know, how would this even work to no-till? And there really wasn't very much information out there about no-till 15 years ago. So, so when I was out in Seattle, I was researching and what I was doing at the time is I was working on farms and coming back because I had a job back in Virginia where I grew up that would take me back in the wintertime so I can make a little bit of money and save up some money to try and start a farm. So I'd go out and work on farms in the summertime and come back and work this job in the wintertime. And so one of the few people out there in 2005 who had was talking about no-till was this professor named Ron Morse, who was a professor at Virginia Tech. And so I was like, well, I'm going back to Virginia this winter anyway. I might as well just hit him up and see, you know, see if I can go down there to Blacksburg where the Virginia Tech University and research farms are, and you know, see if I can pick his brain. And so I emailed him, and he emailed me back, and he said, yeah, sure, you know, come on down to Blacksburg sometime, and you know, and we can talk. And so little did I know that was a job interview, and so he ended up offering me and my wife jobs on the Virginia Tech farm and a family farm in the Blacksburg area, because he was one of the few people that I could find at the time who was studying no-till. In fact, the picture that you see on the screen, in fact, that's my wife there in the red top and one of my friends in the hat. What we were doing is we were doing experiments on what you would call the roller crimper method of no-till, which we'll talk more about later on, where you grow a very dense cover crop and you find some way to kill it. So usually in organics, that's roller crimping, because rolling and crimping, because this method is actually used extensively in conventional systems as well. But we got to point out the conventional systems, they're usually killing their cover crop with herbicides, you know, Roundup or something like that. So obviously that cannot be an organic system. So usually what, you know, basically what the professor that I was working for was doing was he was trying to figure out how to use these roller crimper no-till methods with physically terminating the crop, right? So rolling it and crimping it instead of herbicides. So worked on the research farm at Blacksburg in Virginia Tech in 2005, learned the method. It worked great, only to realize it did not work well for the farm that we were about to start, because the following year, we have a complicated farm history, but the following year we started a farm in Pennsylvania. And so basically the roller crimper method, in my opinion, and a lot of people I've talked to, doesn't scale down very well, because we started out farming on, I think we had a market garden that in 2006 on 3 acres that we rented from my grandma. And so the roller, you know, some of you in the questions I saw, you had questions about how to scale this method up, like what can you do for no-till on a larger scale. And so the roller crimper method, we're going to talk about it later, and that is what I would recommend if you need to do a larger acreage, or you need to do a larger acreage all of a sudden. The roller crimper method is probably the way to do it. However, it did not scale down very well. for our 3-acre market garden. And so the thing is, I learned the method for no-till, and then I started a farm, realized it didn't work for our farm, and just kind of forgot about it for a decade or so. So I went back to tilling because I had a farm to start, because everybody that we had worked for did it that way. And so when we realized that this exciting new method, and at the time that we had learned, didn't work, we just went back to the way that all the farms that we had worked for had done it, as far as tilling, just plowing. And I really kind of forgot about no-till for almost a decade. I had a farm to run, we had kids, life happens, right? We were busy. And then right after I took over the magazine, we started getting these stories by small scale growers who had developed their own no-till methods that work on a much smaller scale. And I thought, gosh, these people figured out how to do what I wanted to do, a decade ago. And so that's what led, we've had a number of articles about no-till and growing for Market magazine, and that just reinvigorated my interest in the whole thing. And so, basically, I thought, like, oh, these people are doing what I wanted to do a decade ago. How do I do it? And so, other than an article here or there, there was no source. There was no book where I could go and read about the no-till methods that farmers had independently developed themselves. And so I thought I should write it, and so that's what I did. I pitched the idea to a publisher of doing an interview style book, talking to all the no-tillers that I could possibly talk to. And luckily I got a publisher interested, because they helped me travel around and talk to these people. So a year and a half later, after visiting farms, I wrote all those interviews up in the book. And so that's been my involvement. Got interested in it and then kind of forgot about it. And now I've also got some pictures in here. I've been using the things that I learned from these growers on my own farm, and that's been a learning process in and of itself. So first of all, okay, so if we're going to talk about the whys of tillages, okay, so why do people till, right? It's a means to an end. I say, people till because you can't go out and plant a carrot in the lawn and expect to get a carrot, right? You've got to wipe the slate clean before you can plant most of the vegetables and flowers that we want to plant. So tillage, the way I think of it is tillage is the only thing it does is that it does prepare the soil for planting. At the same time, it does tend to degrade the soil structure, burn up the organic matter, kill the life that's in the soil, and it's time, fuel, and equipment and labor intensive. So yeah, it gets the job done, right? It gets your farm ready to plant. There's also a lot of drawbacks. So all right, so this is a quote that's in the book, and I love this quote. Okay, it's: tilling the soil is the equivalent of an earthquake, hurricane, tornado, and forest fire occurring simultaneously to the world of soil organisms. And so what radical tillage-hating group made such a strong statement? It was the USDA, the National Resource Conservation Service, which I don't think of as a particularly radical organization. I think they're pretty have a lot of good ideas about trying to steward the farmland better. And so, I think the fact that they would make such a strong statement just goes to the point that tillage is really bad for the soil. In fact, that's one of the reasons that 15 years or so ago, I got interested in no-till, because it seems like everybody who I kept hearing, like, oh, tillage is bad, you should do less of it. But what I wasn't hearing was what do I do instead? And so that's what, just the possibility that there's something else that you can do is what made me excited that it would be a better way to manage the farm. So tillage does result in two self-perpetuating cycles. Okay, so for one thing, it burns up the organic matter in the soil, necessitating adding more organic matter to make up for what was lost. And so this is the situation if you're a grower and you've been in the situation where you're adding compost and other organic matter to your soil, and your organic matter levels are staying the same or even going down over time. That's one reason that this happens, and it can be so frustrating to try to build organic matter, which we all know more organic matter tends to help crops grow better, right? And so it can be really frustrating when you're like, I'm composting, I'm cover cropping, I'm doing all the things that I should be doing to build organic matter, and it's just stagnating. So that's one reason is because all the tillage processes that we do also burn that organic matter that you're going to great lengths to add. It burns it right up. So it's one of those one step forward, one step back kind of situations. The other self-perpetuating cycle that tillage tends to breed is that it brings up weed seeds. So most of us have a very healthy weed seed bank in our soils. In fact, I dare to say, unless we've done something really careful to get rid of the weed seeds, and it usually takes a number of years. It's not usually something like you can just be like, oh yeah, I got rid of my weed seed bank, right? Takes a number of years to get rid of your weed seed bank. So basically you till, it brings weed seeds. One thing, a lot of you probably know this, but I just want to mention for anybody who doesn't, that a lot of weed seeds need light or need to be a certain distance from the surface. They need to be close to the surface to germinate, right? Because if you're the plant, the weed wants to grow into, of course, you don't want to germinate deep down in the soil, and you might not even get to the top. And so one of the things that tillage does is that you may have, let's say one season you dealt with the weeds that you have on the surface, you can feel good about yourself, you go out there and till them up, and then the next spring you have a whole nother crop of weeds. Well, it's because you brought weed seeds that were deeper down in the soil and dormant up to the surface, and you've basically woken them up. And so it's one of those things where tillage leads to more cultivation, which leads to more tillage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so unless you're really careful and don't let any weeds grow to seed, it tends to be, your weed seed bank tends to stay, remain in the soil or even grow over time. So these are sort of like two cycles that tillage tends to perpetuate that we're trying to break with not tilling. So the other thing to note would be that soil has three properties. So obviously, soil scientists or something would tell you that soil has more, there are more metrics to soil than just these three. But, really agriculturally, there are three properties that we're really interested in from an agricultural perspective. And those are the physical properties of the soil, the biological properties of the soil, and the chemical properties of the soil. And tillage is bad for all of them. Okay, so physically bad for the soil. Obviously, this picture is an extreme example, but mechanical tillage does the opposite of what we want to our soil structure. So by soil structure, what I mean is we want the best agricultural soils that are absorb water easily and don't run off in rains and grow better plants. Or it's more like a chocolate cake. It's like a matrix. There's structure to the soil. It's not just like a pile of dust or mud that's held together by water. We want our soil to have structure that's also partially made by the organisms that live in the soil that we're going to get to in a minute. So mechanical tillage, it crushes up that soil structure, right? We need air pockets in our soil structure. And so of course, whether it's a moldboard plow or rototiller or any kind of mechanical tillage instrument tends to go through the soil and just crushes up that structure. So physically you can see it, it may actually fluff it up. A lot of you have probably seen this if you rototill. The rototiller will go through and really fluff the soil up a lot. And that's because it's whipped a lot of air into the soil, but then you'll get some rains or people will walk on it and it'll actually be lower than before because you're crushing, you've destroyed this, a lot of the structure that exists in that soil. Another thing that tillage will do is it burns up the organic matter. And so that's where, because you're whipping extra amounts of air into the soil, the effect that the extra air that has on the soil is that it bonds the carbon dioxide in the soil. All the air that is whipped into the soil bonds to the carbon that is in the soil and causes some of the carbon that's in the soil, which contributes to your organic matter quotient, essentially off gases as carbon dioxide. So that's doubly bad, right? Because you want the carbon to stay in your soil because that increases that's your organic matter. And also you don't want the carbon off-gassing, because that adds to the carbon dioxide that's contributing to climate change. So the physical changes make the soil more likely to erode and less able to absorb and hold water. And then the organic matter off-gassing is obviously bad in a lot of ways. And so this is really important particularly in arid areas. So if most of you are in Connecticut, it might not be as important, but we all know the weather is getting more erratic. And so the statistic that I like to throw in front of people here is that a 1% increase in soil organic matter holds an additional 25,000 gallons of water per acre. And so that means that you basically, the more carbon that the more organic matter, I should say, sorry, because carbon is one component of the organic matter in your soil, but all the organic matter in your soil is not carbon. So I need to be careful there. But the point is that if the more organic matter in your soil, the more that your soil is like a sponge, and not only can absorb the water faster, but it can hold more water. And so that just means if you hit drought conditions, your plants, it's going to take longer for your plants to suffer, and you may even be able to get through the drought without any damage, more so than soils that are lower in organic matter. So tillage is bad for soil life. I bet most of you have seen a diagram like what I have on the side of this slide here of the soil food web. And so tillage I think it's pretty obvious to think about how tillage kills the soil food web, right? We've got all kinds of critters down in the soil, and just physically bringing any kind of tillage implement through there just crushes them up and destroys their habitat. And we're finding out more and more all the time how the biology in the soil helps maintain healthy soil and helps maintain healthy plants. Okay, so one particularly important component of the soil food web that tillage is particularly hard on is fungi. And we were talking about the structure of soil before. Well, it turns out that fungi are really important in forming the aggregates. Okay, so the structures that help plants grow in soil. So and help them resist erosion and promote water infiltration. And this is partially because fungi have these long, they're essentially like fungal roots called hyphae, right? So fungi that grows through the soil. One of the reasons it's useful for us is because it can make connections between minerals that are deeper down in the soil than the roots are, or minerals and nutrients that are farther away from plants. A lot of this could be a whole presentation by itself, so I'm not going to try to go completely into this. But the idea is that a lot of plants, brassicas are a notable exception, but a lot of plants form alliances with fungi, basically, and where the fungi will essentially help bring nutrients to the plant's roots in exchange for some sugars from the plant. And so fungi is particularly prone to being destroyed by tillage because it has, it's such a long, it has this long root system. And of course you draw a plow or a rototiller or anything through there, it's going to break it up. And so over time, so one of the things that researchers have realized is that over time, a lot of tillage promotes a bacteria heavy soil environment. Though most vegetables and flowers, we're finding out do best in a soil environment that's more or less balanced between bacteria and fungus. And so the analogy that I use to try to drive this point home is that I think of this, if you think of the soil as like a village, right? You've got all kinds of microorganisms living there. You got bacteria, you've got fungi living in there. So you got this village, you got all those different people living in there. You bring a plow through, the village has just been turned over and pretty much destroyed. Well, it's harder on the fungus because it's so long. and the microorganisms, because they get crushed up, and the bacteria is so small, the bacteria bounces back from tillage more quickly. And so if these repeated cycles of tillage keep killing the bacteria and microorganisms, and the bacteria come out of it, the bacteria tend to feed on the fungi and microorganisms that have been killed. And so that's why over time you get a more bacteria heavy soil environment, because you keep killing the fungus, and the bacteria keep feasting on everybody else. So but obviously bad for soil life. And then it's also bad for soil chemistry. In this case, I mean, by soil chemistry, I mean basically the nutrients that we want to be there for our plants. So accelerating the oxidation of organic matter. So this is part of the reason you do tillage, because whipping all that air into the soil promotes a short-term release of fertility at the expense of the long-term reserves of fertility and organic matter in the soil. So it's one of those things where you're trading a short-term gain for a long-term problem for your soil. And also that destruction of the organic matter releases carbon that's been in the soil into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. So not good for the chemical, the chemistry that you want to exist in your soil. So this is a larger topic, obviously, but something like 50 to 70% of the world's carbon in farmland soils is already off-gassed into the atmosphere due to tillage. And so this is one aspect where, if we're trying to figure out what to do with climate change, farming is definitely a big contributor, which also means that farming can be a big part of the solution, right? Because if we can it obviously is not going to happen overnight, but if we can take acreage that's currently off-gassing and turn it into land that is sequestering carbon, we change the equation. And that's a way, not only that we could change the equation on climate change over time, but those of us who are concerned about it, we want it can be an overwhelming problem to think about climate change, but it can be really satisfying to feel like, well, I'm doing my part, or there's something I can do on my own little farm that's going to make a dent in that. So that's an important consideration too. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm not really into machinery. We do have a tractor, but it's not my favorite thing to do. So, tillage is more mechanically intensive than I would really like. I realized when we started our first farm, we bought a much larger tractor than we really needed or wanted, because we thought we realized we were going to have to moldboard plow it. So I feel like field prep uses a lot of labor and energy, has a lot of drawbacks in that it can be delayed by poor weather, right? Yeah, I know here in my part of Maine, we get a lot of snow. We have mud season, right? In the springtime, when all that snow is slowly melting off the field. And all farmers around here do is talk about in the springtime is like, can you get on your fields yet? And because everything gets so swampy and muddy, farmers are really at the mercy for when they can plow their fields based on when their fields are dried out enough. So another thing is that it requires a lot of investment. You got to buy the tractor, you got to buy the plow, the disc harrow, spring tooth harrow, or some other kind of harrow, rototiller, spader, bed former. So it required, like, doing all that. It's a barrier for some farms. Getting access to farmland is hard enough. Having to then come up with the money to buy all that equipment I feel like is a limiter for a lot of farms. So I realize that's personal. I've definitely met some farmers who seem to live to start up their tractors, and so that's fine. That's great too. There are ways to do no-till, like that roller crimper method that I was talking about that we're going to get to in just a minute. That's a way that you can do no-till on a much larger scale. And if you really like equipment, you can use a lot of equipment to do that kind of no-till. So, but my thing is, what I want to see is just more farms. And so I think if you don't have to go out and if all you have to do is get access to a piece of land and some really simple equipment, more people are going to be able to get into farming than if they have to buy a tractor, a moldboard plow, a rototiller, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So So I'm as excited by no-till for what it can do for the soil as for, I feel like, people who may have the confidence to take on an acre plot, or, you know, start small, because they think they may be able to do it without having to buy all the tractor and all the extra machinery and everything. So just to sum it up, I mean, this is just a summing page. You know, the advantages of no-till are that it can help increase organic matter, reduce the need for machinery. Oh, one thing that I try not to just read my slides because, you know, the words are up there, that's what they're for. But one thing I didn't talk, so I'll let you read the rest of this slide, but one thing that I haven't touched on yet is that it is a way to set your produce apart in an increasingly crowded marketplace, because you know, it's a good thing. There are more farmers markets than ever right now. And so we all have these different, you know, I feel like one of the jobs of small farming is to make your produce or your flowers not a commodity, right? You don't want people to just say, like, it doesn't matter, you know, tomato, right? It doesn't matter if this tomato's from Florida or California or Connecticut, right? You want to be like, you want people to not think of produce and flowers as just some commodity product to be bought for the lowest price. You want people to be able to tell people, yeah, you know, this is one of the things that make my flowers or produce or whatever special. So, you know, whether you're no-till, reduced tillage, or anything like that, that can be part of the story that helps to set your produce apart in an increasingly crowded marketplace. And so I think that sums it up pretty well. Environmental benefits. So here I have the you know, carbon cycle that you probably a lot of you have seen. And I think that there are a lot of environmental benefits to no-tilling, including reducing, if you can use less farm machinery, then of course you can reduce the pollution coming from that farm machinery. Like we talked about, reducing the off-gassing carbon dioxide from tillage, reducing the erosion from tillage, because of course soils are most vulnerable to erosion right after they've been tilled. And so that's when a lot of that happens. And so if you're tilling less or not at all, of course, then there's just going to be less erosion. And the thing is, once you've stopped tilling, you should be able to start building that organic matter, which also, so if you're building organic matter, which your plants are going to like, that means you're also sequestering carbon, which is obviously a great thing too. So there's, I think no-till, you know, I think some people hear no-till and think like, oh, everything's done by hand. And actually, once again, the roller crimper method in particular can be scaled up pretty big, pretty quickly. But I do think there are actually, even when you're doing it by hand, there's a lot of efficiencies for no-till. So one thing is the efficient use of space, because when you can, you know, one of the things that a lot of no-till growers prize themselves on is being able to flip a bed, as far as take an old crop out and get a new crop in, you know, sometimes in the same day. It's harvest in the morning, plant in the afternoon kind of thing. So it can be a very efficient use of space when you're not waiting around, you know, to have the time or have a whole block clear to be able to till a whole block. It can be very efficient when you're just almost as soon as you're taking one crop out, you're putting a new crop in. You can have you know, if you set it up that way, you can have all of your land cropped almost all the time. So another thing is that it speeds up succession planting because there's no break for tillage. One efficiency, it can make it almost irrelevant how bad your soil is. I talked to some people who had started farms on land that was considered not suitable for agriculture, either because it's on a slope, it's on clay, or it's very rocky. And a lot of those people, you know, and I think it would have been unsuitable for agriculture if they had to plow it or really get into that soil. But some of the people with all those soil challenges that I talked to, they basically just built up. It's sort of the lasagna gardening technique, where they just put organic matter on top of whatever poor soils they had. And so didn't matter how bad their soil was, because they were basically making their own soil on top of whatever bad soil they had. Yeah, so no-till should reduce your weeding over time as you as you if you don't let weeds go to seed, and then you don't bring more up with more tillage, over time, your time spent weeding should go down. And one really important thing is it gets you on the ground more quickly in the springtime. In fact, I mean, this point was driven home. I think this hasn't much to do for me, where I can start planting things for weeks, even here in Maine, before I could get on the ground with a tractor, right? So I can plant earlier, even here in Maine. This point was really driven home for me when I was visiting with Singing Frogs Farm out in California, because they said that even though they have a really good climate, they're north of the Bay Area, they're in Sonoma County, so they have freezes, but they have a really great growing climate. And they were telling me about how when they first started doing their farmers market, I think they said there really wasn't that much produce at their farmers market until April or May or something like that. And it was all because they and all their competitors were cover cropping, but they had to wait. So, which is great, cover cropping, but they had to wait to terminate those cover crops, they had to wait because they get winter rains. And so they had to wait until they could get on the field, plow the cover crop in. And then of course they had to wait an additional 2 weeks for the soil to start digesting that cover crop before they could even plant anything. And so they realized they could be the earliest ones at their farmers market by a lot if they just stop tilling. And so that's a huge efficiency for a lot of people, to be not at the mercy of the weather and just be able to plant, get on fields and plant almost whenever you'd want to. So these are all, we already talked about all these points, so I'm not going to take the time to go over all these. But this is basically just a summing slide where I kind of talk about what we just talked about. So we're almost done with the whys, and one of the last things that I wanted to talk about is one of the things I'm most excited about no-till is I feel like it can help increase the viability of small farms and help more people start small farms, because I think people kind of get hung up on size with farms. Some people say like, oh, we need more bigger farms. Some people say we need more small farms. We just need more farms. We just need more real, farms that aren't part of the industrial food system, growing healthy food and healthy for the earth at the same time. And so one of my points is that if you don't need all that equipment, if someone's going to start a farm, you're probably not starting out at 100 acres, right? You're probably going to start small and scale your farm up over time. I think that if we have no-till or reduced tillage, where people don't feel like they have to go out and buy a lot of equipment, more people are going to, try a lease or buy a piece of land or something like that, if they don't also have to buy a whole ton of equipment, because they can give it a shot without as much investment. That's just what I want. I want people to try it, because I think, the more people that try farming, we're going to have more real farms. And so like I said, with our first farm, we basically bought a tractor just for plowing, a much bigger tractor than we needed. And so I sometimes I feel like people almost like scale their farm to their equipment. They'll be like, instead, might want to do 1 or 2 acres, but we need to make the tractor payment, so let's do 3 or 4. And so I think that's one of the things that excites me the most with no-till, is there's less stuff you got to buy, and hopefully that'll lead to more people starting farms and being successful on farms. There's definitely some disadvantages for no-till. Perennial weeds can be a problem. That's he and his wife.
So Andrew, I think you're breaking up a little bit.
I can.
And we're frozen. Okay. Oh, we got you back, Andrew.
Am I back?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay. If that happens again, I'll hotspot. Usually our connection's pretty good, despite being out here in middle of Maine. But
Okay.
yeah, so perennial weeds can definitely be a problem there because some of them can, those long-lived perennial weeds can, some of them can survive a tarping, whether you're using a opaque tarp, it's called occultation, or the clear tarp. Once again, and then there's no way to quickly cultivate weeds if they do become a problem. If you've set up your, done your system in a way, you said like, I'm not cultivating and it's not set up to be cultivated anymore, that your weed eraser is gone. Another thing is to point out is that particularly with the methods that we're about to talk about, they use a lot of mulch on top of the soil. So mulch soil can be slower to worm in the spring. So places up here in the Northeast, that can be a problem. You just got to remember that's probably not the way to get your early spring crops with heavily mulched beds. The systems can take some time to become established. One theme that I heard when talking to all these growers is that most of them said that they got better and better. Their systems got better and better over time. And so I'm just saying your first year or two are probably not going to be your easiest year or two with no-till. Some of the methods would be hard to scale up. So that's one thing we're going to talk about is that you got to think about whether you're doing a smaller scale or larger scale and choose an appropriate method. And then lastly, slugs can be a problem in high residue field systems just because slugs like to eat rotting organic matter. And so, and it also gives them places to hide. And so if you, so slugs can be a problem, and there are ways to get around that too. And we'll talk about them in the house. So this is we're going to talk now. We can talk about the how to do no-till. And so after I did all the interviews for the book, I sat down and tried to sort of map of where everybody was, and there really were a few common themes in no-till. And if I had to sum the whole thing down to anything, it's no-till. It's about the mulches. And one thing that you're doing in almost all of these systems, you're using a mulch in some fashion or another, either a mulch before the crop that you take off and then you plant the crop, or some of the mulches you put on and plant the crop through. But in some sense, almost all these no-till methods, you are using mulch in some way or another to replace plowing, right? The mulch takes the place of the mechanical aspects of tillage. So so mulch grown in place, which I call the roller crimper method. That's what's going on in this field. The general idea is that you grow a really dense cover crop like rye or a mix of rye and vetch or something like that. That's the most common, partially because those are really common cover crops, but there are a lot of different combinations depending on your season and in your circumstances. There's a lot of different crops or cover crops that you can use to form a dense mulch. And so the idea is you grow you grow a cover crop, and then for organics you roll and crimp it down. And so if you see this tractor here, it has that red implement on the back that has kind of a chevron shape on it. So what that is that tractor has it's a drum on the back that it has a spindle through it. So the drum, when you engage it with the soil, it's not motorized or anything, but you just put it down onto the soil. And so as you drive the tractor over the bed, that roller rolls, and that those chevron shaped things on the roller are fins, metal fins that have been welded on there, because some of the first experiments with roller crimpers were just rollers. So they just had a smooth roller, almost like those lawn rollers are different, or is basically just a round roller. And what they found is that a lot of the cover crops that are really vigorous and do the best in these systems, like rye and vetch, they're so vigorous, if you just roll them down, they, especially at the wrong time, they may actually pop back up again and start growing again. And so getting that timing right is one of the real tricks of the roller crimper method. And so what people found is if they welded fins onto the outside of the drum, and I don't know. There's probably some engineering reason why they went with the chevron shape, like in the picture. So what they found is if they welded fins onto the drum, they would crimp the stem of the crop, right? So it would kind of like kink the stem just enough where the juices couldn't flow anymore from the roots up to the top of the plant. And so what it does is it just helps to make sure that the cover crop actually dies, because there's, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, there's quite a bit of no-till, of conventional no-till that's done, but it uses herbicides to knock that cover crop down. In fact, that's one of the big things that the professor that I worked for at Virginia Tech, who was studying organic no-till, was doing. He was looking at a lot of the systems that had been developed for conventional no-till, where people were using herbicides, and he was just figuring out he was taking their system. He was just figuring out how to kill the cover crop with mechanical means instead of herbicides. So the roller crimper method, the pros and cons, as I see them, are, for one thing, it requires a lot of planning. And I'm going to touch on that more when we get down to planting windows, but it's not a just simple set and forget it, do it anytime kind of method, because basically all the cover crops that you might use to make the mat. And so that's what's going in this picture. As you can see, this cover crop has been rolled down, and as you can see, it's dead. And so what this guy is doing, he's got a bulb planter, and so he's transplanting, I don't know, tomatoes or something. And so he's taking a chunk out, and so he's just making a hole through the cover crop, and he's going to throw a tomato transplant in there. And so this is the more hand scale version. I've got some pictures later of a more mechanized version of roller crimper. But basically, it does require a lot of planning, because every cover crop that you might use to form the layer of mulch that are going to keep the weeds from coming up around your crop has some window when it's going to be, when it wants to grow, and it's going to have some window, some planting window when it can be killed. And so that's the difficulty that we ran into on our farm, because when we first started our farm in Pennsylvania, we were running it like a pretty typical market farm. We were doing farmers markets every week. And so we had plantings every week of radishes and salad mix and all the stuff that has to be planted in succession all year long if you want to have crops all year long for a farmer's market, right? And so the problem is that the cover crops that we wanted to grow for no-till, they had certain planting windows. Like they would have a springtime planting window, but they wouldn't give us a planting window pretty much every week all season long. So that's why I say it requires a lot of planning, because you got to think about when you want to have crops to plant, and make sure that the cover crop is going to be ready then. And the other thing is that a lot of the cover crops that you might want to plant for springtime crops have to be established the previous fall. So you may already be doing that. I mean, a lot of organic farmers, you're like, okay, sure, I'm already cover cropping, I get that. But you've got to think even farther back and say, like, okay, the following spring, I'm going to be wanting to plant tomatoes or whatever you want to be planting, and make sure you've got a cover crop that's going to be ready to be roller crimped at the right time. The other thing about the roller crimper method is it may not be never till. What I mean by that is that okay, so the Rodale Institute did a lot of the pioneering work on this roller crimper, and they were working with the professor that I was working with at Virginia Tech. And so the way they were doing it is they were tilling every 3 or 4 years. They were tilling to knock back perennial weeds, and then they would do no-till on a particular piece of ground. They would do no tillage at all for 3 or 4 years or something like that. But then every 4th year or something like that, they would till, because one of the things they found is that over time, at least for them, the amount of perennial weeds were creeping up. And so I think if people really like the roller crimper method, you can make it never till. But the way a lot of people do it, it's not never till. It's basically just a really reduced form of tillage. For some people it may be a pro, some it may be a con, but it definitely requires more equipment than some of the other no-till methods, because you need a seeder appropriate to whatever scale you're working on, that you may need a no-till. You know, if you're working on a larger acreage, you're probably going to want a no-till seeder, so you can no-till drill into residue and stuff like that. So some, you know, on the one hand, you may have to buy more equipment. On the other hand, buying more equipment may enable you to also farm more acreage. So that's not necessarily a pro or con. It really depends on who you are. Okay, so planting windows are determined by the timing of the cover crop, not any time you want. What I mean by that is that cover crops, you can't just, the timing has to be really specific to get the cover crops just right for rolling and crimping, because you need a really good cover crop. You have to fertilize and basically treat your cover crop almost like a cash crop, because you have to have a lot of biomass, since the whole idea is that you're going to grow this big cover crop and then you're going to crimp it down. And it almost the way the growers use black plastic to suppress the weeds. Instead of plastic, you have this layer of mulch. So it's cool because you grew, instead of, say, taking hay bales or taking any kind of mulch and putting it where you want it to be, you're basically just growing your mulch right in place. You're growing your mulch right where you want it to be, which is pretty slick. On the other hand, not all cover crops will die at the right time. There's in fact, most cover crops have a very specific window that you need to terminate them at. Otherwise, you'll have problems. So the idea is that if you try to terminate a lot of cover crops, especially the strong ones like rye or vetch, if you try to terminate them before they start flowering, they're so determined to continue their vegetative growth that sometimes even if you have a roller crimper with those fins on it, that they still may not die. They may grow back. And so the sweet spot for most crops is when they're in flower but haven't set any hard seed yet, because just like if you crimp them too early, they won't die. If you crimp them too late, once they've had flowers for a long time, then you're going to have hard seed, and then your cover crop is going to be planting its own weeds. So you have the planting windows that you get, you have to be really on top of your timing, because if you're too early or too late on terminating that cover crop, it may not go so well. One of the things is that the method may not work if your cover crop is not good. You know, one thing working with the method at Virginia Tech is we saw growers who either the fertility wasn't good enough, or had problems with a seeder, or seeds washed out after they planted the cover crop. So any of those reasons that results in a cover crop not being really dense is going to make no-till, not the roller crimper no-till, not work as well, since you're relying on that mulch layer from the crop to suppress the weeds. If your cover crop is spotty, you're going to have weeds wherever the cover crop isn't. So you gotta have a really good cover crop. And it's, you know, some fields had spots where the cover crop wasn't so great, and then they had weedy spots, and the rest of the field was fine. So you just got to take your cover crop seriously. But when it works, the weed suppression can be very good. And it can also be scaled. So one of the other advantages of this is it can be scaled more extensively and quickly than some of the other methods, because you can go out there and seed, can seed a cover crop to a larger spot, and then you can go in, crimp it down. And I have some pictures here of some transplanters that will work with no-till. And so you could actually plant a large plot. So I've seen this method work really well for tomatoes and winter squashes and pumpkins and things like that. In fact, my understanding is that it commercially, in both conventional and organic no-till, there's one of the most popular things is growing pumpkins and squashes and things like that, because as you'll see, there's the mulch takes care of the early season weeds, and then the squashes and pumpkins and things like that, then they canopy out and suppress the rest of the weeds. So here's a picture of someone who has doing the roller crimper method on just beds, and I thought it's just a good example of how it works. So here they've got a really healthy cover crop, nice and dense. And so this is interesting. They've got a roller crimper mounted on the front of their tractor, so you can see they just engage it with the soil, and then they're rolling down the bed. And so you can see in the front here, there's a couple of beds that they already rolled down. And so that's basically how it works. You know, you just go into a really healthy cover crop at the right time and you roll it down. Some roller crimpers just rely on the downward pressure of the hydraulic arms of the tractor to squish the cover crop. Some of them have, you can put water in the drum, since the roller crimper is basically a drum, and let the water will add to the downward pressure. So just depends on how they work. So here's an example. In fact, we worked on a farm that had a transplanter very similar to this. This is not a farm that I worked on, but you can see that you could go pretty fast here. What this is a fairly standard vegetable transplanter that has been modified to work in a high residue environment. So basically they're extra coulters, so that, you know, like big pizza cutters right up at the front of this machine. So it will cut through the residue, because the thing is, most equipment that is designed to go through the soil for normal tillage situations is not going to work in a roller crimper, just because you've got so much residue. Most things that just have a shank or something to cut through the soil are going to just start building up all the organic matter and drag it through. So that's one thing. A lot of equipment, there's roller crimper situations, some that can be retrofitted with extra coulters, but that is just a consideration. So you may have to either buy new equipment or retrofit it to get, if you have equipment that you want to keep using for roller crimper no-till. So this is what I mean. And this is so that big pizza cutter looking thing is the coulter. And this is a lower tech version of a transplanter that you can use with in a high residue situation. So this is just basically the coulter goes in the front and cuts through the crop. And then this leg on the back, it's really just a really simple transplanter. It just goes through and loosens the soil. So you can go through and throw transplants in behind that transplanter. So here's an example of someone who did roller crimper no-till, more of a hand scale. Actually, this is from that first picture where the person was doing the cover crop in a roller crimper on a bed scale. And so what they did is they crimped their cover crop down, and then they just went through with a shovel, took a shovel full of soil out, threw a shovel full of compost in, and put a tomato transplant in there. So you don't have to get fancy and have transplanters and all that kind of stuff. Here's another example of a bigger field that was done with the roller crimper. In fact, this field was done with that, I believe, with that transplanter, the tractor transplanter you saw a minute ago. And so I got a before and after shot here. So you can see how basically they rolled the cover crop down on this field. Instead of, say, black plastic or some other mulch, they've got this nice organic mulch on the field. So this is what the field looked like early in the season. And then you can see how then it leafed out. And so, because what happens is, over the course of the season, as the mulch of the cover crop starts breaking down, and eventually you get weed growth. And that's why this system works really well with pumpkins and squash, because by the time you start having weed growth, there's the canopy from the pumpkins and squash to suppress weeds. So there's one guy that I talked to in my book. His name is Sean Yadrinchek, and he's in fact, he's farming in South Carolina, and he realized that some of his longer season crops, like peppers and eggplants and things like that, the weed suppression from the cover crop was not long enough for those long season crops. He would end up getting weeds and peppers and eggplants and stuff like that. And plus he's in South Carolina, so they also can grow those things in the field even longer than we can. So his innovation, what he realized he could do, if you can see on the bed that's right in front of you with the drip tape going down on it, that's just the roller crimped cover crop. But then on the left, what he did is he found he could get leaves for free from his local municipality, and they were chopped up. And so what he would do, where he needed extra weed suppression, is that he would put down a layer of leaf mulch on top of the mulch that he had grown in place. And he found that he could get really good long season weed suppression from the addition of the leaves to the mulch. So that's a picture of his farm. So if I'm gonna leave it there on the roller crimper no-till. So if you're really interested in roller crimper method, this book will give you more information. This whole book is only about the roller crimper method. And so, in fact, that Jeff Moyer, who wrote the book, he was working with the professor that I worked for at Virginia Tech at the time. Jeff Moyer is now the executive director of Rodale. So that's there's a lot more to roller crimper no-till, and there's a lot, that's all this book talks about. So if you're thinking that might be the method for you, you might want to check that out. Okay, so of the rest of the methods that are not roller crimper no-till, I figure there are mainly, there are basically two ways to categorize the rest of the methods. Is there are methods that use mulches that are usually not organic, so usually plastic or some other mulches, but that don't stay in place while the crop is down. Or there are other ways to use mulches. Instead of growing them there's ways to use organic mulches that are applied to the soil and stay there. So that's one thing that's different between organic no-till and I think more like conventional tilled crops, is that most of the time when I see conventional tillage, people have the plastic down during the season. One of the nice things about no-till is that they're taking the plastic off and they're reusing it because it's not on there while the crop is there. So, these the two methods that have plastic on the soil and then it's removed are called so occultation is a fancy word for tarping with an opaque tarp. So basically just starving the plant for light. And then solarization is what we call it when you put down clear plastic, like old used greenhouse plastic, for example, and you basically fry the weeds that are there. And so although I'll say, if you're thinking about how to get started with no-till, and if you're currently tilling, I talked to some people who would do one last till. So for example, if your problem weed is dock or burdock or something, you could do whatever, you could do one last till for the dock or burdock, whatever your problem weed is, because you're not going to be able to till anymore if you set up these systems. And so you might want to take one last crack at those weeds. Whether you are tilling or not, you can just get started by putting down tarps. Is one way to do it. And so you can,
Andrew, you're breaking up again. Potentially, if you would like to.
Occultation being just tarping, it's sort of like the principle is just very simple in that it's like if you've ever walked out to your farm and set a bucket down and forgot about it and come back 2 months later, you get this perfectly, and you pick it up, you get this perfectly brown spot of soil where the grass died and microorganisms came up and ate it. So that's what's going on with occultation. Is you're basically just starving the plants for light, and then once they die, if you leave it there long enough, microorganisms come up and eat the vegetation. So if you do it for a short period of time, you may get dead vegetation, but it may still be there. If you do it for long enough, it may be dead and be gone. So you can hear how this guy's got those. He's using landscape fabric in this case. So he's got landscape fabric over there, and in the foreground, he's already had that landscape fabric down, and he just took it off. And so you can see that all the vegetation is dead, and I think he's going to throw some compost on there. We can see, plastic mulches. So the plastic mulches, occultation, and solarization. So you can see here, this is just a bigger example of that. I mean, this is mostly what I see people doing, is getting these, this is silage tarp. Some people call them bunker covers or panda covers because they're black on one side and white on the other. And so, mostly I see people trying to do whole blocks at a time by taking these bunker covers out. And the advantage of the bunker cover is it's something that's made for dairies. they're very thick plastic, so they can be used over and over and over again. Another advantage is that you may be able to get them for free, or a very low price. Some of the uses in dairies and grain farms and things like that, they'll get used once and then they're thrown away. And so if you have dairy farmers or grain farmers that are neighbors, you may be able to get these for free, because they're also used to store grain sometimes. So the pros and cons of occultation and solarization requires some planning, but not that you don't have to have that much planning. It depends on which one of these. So solarization, for example, is a lot quicker, but it only works during the warm part of the year. In fact, so Brian O'Hara, he's a grower there in Connecticut, a really great grower. He was telling me how one of the breakthroughs for him on solarization is when he realized that he could flip a bed, or he could, if he, let's say he had a bed he had harvested the crops out of, and it had just some residual weed growth left in it, he could put used greenhouse plastic down on it for just 24 hours. And now it had to be during the warm part of the year and a sunny day, but he could just zap all the weeds that are left on a bed after harvesting a crop in just a 24-hour period, if it was warm enough, and then get back and replant that bed without any tillage. Occultation works more slowly in that you will need more planning, right, than say 24 hours, but it can be done anytime. In fact, if anybody's out there thinking about how to get started with this, I would say go put a tarp down. You could put a tarp down on the snow. You could wait until the snow starts to melt in the springtime and then throw a tarp down, because the longer the tarps are down for occultation, the better it works. The more complete the vegetation is killed, and the more it's chewed up. So especially if you're going into a pasture or something like that, a field that has a sod in it, the sooner the better. The longer you can have a tarp down, the better your weed control is going to be. So like we talked about, it may not kill perennial weeds. Some perennial weeds have enough reserves that they can live for a long time down there under the tarp. So that's tends to be the one of the bugaboos of both occultation and solarization, is it may get a lot of the annual weeds, but it may not get the perennial weeds. Another pro or con is that it does require large tarps or pieces of plastic. Luckily, a lot of plastic, a lot of growers have used greenhouse plastic. Like when we recover greenhouses, we keep the plastic. So we've been able to do quite a bit of occultation and solarization without actually buying any plastic, which is reusing plastic that we already had. So my last thing about occultation or solarization is it may still require an organic mulch to be applied to the soil to suppress weeds. What I mean by that, looking at this bed here, so this bed in this picture had a cover crop on it, a full cover crop when that tarp went down. And so they just were able to leave it on there. They planned ahead. They left it on there all winter long. And so not only did the cover crop die, but the microorganisms came and ate it. So my point is, though, if let's say this bed, you knew it had a really heavy weed seed bank, you might still need to apply an organic mulch to that bed during the growing season to suppress the weed growth. And this is, once again, I'll say these methods that I'm talking about, most people use more than one of these. People mostly are not purists. They're like, I'm just roller crimpering, or I'm just using occultation. Okay. I want you to think of everything we talk about in this talk as sort of like a no-till toolbox, because a lot of people do occultation and then they do an organic mulch afterwards, or it's, some combination. So, mix and match here, folks. And part of it is just your own conditions. We all have different soils and different problem weeds and different things. And so that's one of the things that I like about no-till, is that it's very flexible. You can employ different, a number of these different methods to get the solutions that you need. And so, so this is an example of no-till in the occultation in greenhouse. In fact, this was This was, in fact, this was just this was a salad mix crop that was going to seed. And this guy, Ricky Baruch, this is Seeds of Solidarity Farm in Massachusetts. So this was so interesting to me. I know I got to go quickly, but what he did is we were in this greenhouse. This was his early spring greens crop. And because he wanted to feed the bees, this was his first greens crop of the season. When the greens were harvested out and we're starting to want to go to seed anyway, he just let them go to seed. Or no, not go to seed. He let them flower. So the bees could come inside and eat. And then, but before they set hard seed, he just tarped the whole greenhouse down. And so it turned from a problem, like, oh no, those greens are going to go to seed and I'm going to plant my own weeds. He turns it into an opportunity where he just tarps everything down. And so I believe when we were in this greenhouse, when I visited him there, I think this greenhouse had been tarped for about a month. And so you can see there's still crop residue. And he was telling me, if he needed to plant that day, he showed me how the crop is so dead. It's kind of like the consistency of hay. You could just rake it off with your hands or a rake or something like that. And he said he didn't eat it. So he would just leave the tarp down for a while and let the microorganisms start to break the organic matter down some more. So this is a picture from Bear Mountain Farm. They're flower growers out in Oregon. Was able to visit with them. And I really love their style because it's just so simple. What they were saying is that in the flower world, there's no equivalent to, say, radishes or salad mix or anything like that, where you can just plant something and have a crop 30 days later. And so when I visited Bear Mountain Farm, it was in October. In fact, when I was there, they just got their first frost. And so they say, because they don't have these quick cycling crops for their flowers, like salad mix or radishes or something like that, when a crop is done, they just knock a crop down. Like if there's not another crop coming right behind it, they just knock the previous crop down and they just tarp it over. That's what's going on here. Because it looks kind of like a mess, but this is not, this is not done. Well, they just knock everything down, tarp it, and leave it for a good long time. And they treat their microorganisms almost like micro livestock. They have a name for it. They call them their ground peeps. They're like this is Tony from Bear Mountain, and what he told me, he said, well, I used to take all this time taking all the residue off of my beds, piling it up, taking it somewhere else to compost it. Then I'd make compost and then bring it back to the bed. And he thought, why am I doing all this extra work? Why not just tarp it down, let the microorganisms do the work? And then, what he said is they would so if I'm there in October, they're not going to have another crop in this bed until the following February or March or something like that. Right. Because they have a fairly mild climate there in Oregon with a lot of precipitation over the wintertime. They just let it sit all winter long. And by the time they come back into it in February or March, it's broken down and ready to be planted. So I love those systems that are just thinking like, what is the least we can do to get to get a result here. And so that's a really effective use of occultation. So this is a farm. Oh, this is Brian O'Hara's farm in Connecticut. And so this is what he was showing me about how, so this bed he had just finished harvesting. So this bed where you see the clear plastic on it, he had just harvested out this part of the bed and there were just some residual weeds, but right, he's not, you can see there's a lot of residue on the surface. He can't cultivate, he can't take a tiller through there. So what he can do is he could just put that plastic there. And I visited him in the middle of summer when it was very hot. So he just puts that plastic there for 24 hours. And so what he told me is that, as long as it's 60 or 70 degrees and sunny, it gets hot enough under that plastic. It gets up to 130 or 40 degrees, which is, what the temperature that compost is supposed to get up to. And it just fries all the weeds that are sitting on the surface, I think, without really impacting the soil life that's down further. And then he can just come back the next day and replant that bed. So that's an example of the solarization. This is another farm in Massachusetts using solarization. They took a lot of their methods from Brian. So same thing. They're just trying to get this bed ready for another crop without tilling it. They just hold the tarps down. And I'll say the thing that I've had the most problems with on my own farm is just keeping the tarps there, because I've done some long-term tarping, and you know, the tarps can be fine for many, many days, but then you get a big enough windstorm and they're blowing around. So, you know, that's what one thing I would say is take, you know, put more stuff on your tarps than you think you need to keep them there. So one of the other most common methods to be used is organic mulches that are applied to the soil. I also call this the deep mulch method. So organic mulches, pros and cons. You know, the mulches can be anything: straw, cardboard, compost. A lot of people in rural areas have access to different byproducts, you know, bark. Some places have nut hulls and things like that. So, you know, there may be, if there's any kind of organic matter that's available cheaply in your area, you may be able to use it for mulching. And so in this case, it's as simple as instead of relying on cultivation to suppress weeds, basically just building up a layer of mulch on the soil that the weeds will have trouble sprouting through. So it can be done fairly quickly, right? You can, you know, if you're prepared, you can potentially apply mulch and then plant on the same day. Weed suppression can be excellent depending on the mulch that you're using, and then of course the mulches contribute to soil organic matter. So there's a number of different ways to, I mean, the idea is pretty simple of mulching. I'm sure I don't, you know, it's not something we need to belabor, but it's like so many things, it's the execution. So here, I just got a bunch of pictures from farms that I visited, or some of them sent me pictures. Let's look at some of them. So, so disadvantages of mulches is that they may be time consuming to apply. If you don't have a mechanical way to apply some of these mulches, it can take a while. You've got to keep in mind that light colored mulches may cool the soil. So you probably don't want to use, like in this farm, you can see they use tons of straw, which is actually pretty efficient because they get those big round bales. And I don't know if you haven't done it before, it's actually really easy to unroll a round bale. If you buy round bales, if you just cut the strings, usually if you just start rolling it, it will unroll the opposite from the way it was rolled up. Sometimes you may have to kind of like pull a flake off the end and get it started, but it's pretty easy to unroll them almost like a giant roll of toilet paper. So that's what they're doing. And, you know, this is a farm down in Arkansas. Oh, and so that's one thing I would note. The only two farms that I was able to talk to that use this deep mulch method as far as a lot of hay, really deep layers of hay, are in the south, hot parts of the Midwest. And I'm thinking that's not a coincidence, right? I don't see a lot of people up here in the Northeast doing these really heavy layers of straw mulch because it's light colored and it cools the soil down. So, if you're trying to grow crops that prefer cooler weather in the height of summer, it actually can be a really good method. You've probably all seen, they make all these different colors of mulches. They'll make white plastic mulch and things like that to try to keep crops cool in the summertime. And so, I'm thinking, obviously, if you use straw or something like that, you'll get that same light colored benefit, but you won't be buying all that plastic. So here's some examples. This is that farm in Arkansas. So this is what their farm looks like. And they said they don't do a whole lot of weeding. I mean, of course, obviously they can't take a cultivator through there because they have so much organic matter on the ground that it would build up in a cultivator. But they said that by not bringing up the weed seeds and trying to stay on top of their weeds and keeping them mulched, they've actually got they've got their weeding down pretty low. So I love this picture because you can see how tall those kale plants are. They've been picking them for quite a while, and so you can see there's a couple weeds down there, but they're also pretty well. There's not a whole lot of weeding. So obviously, I don't know how much weeding they did, but they've definitely got some suppression going on, and the kale looks pretty happy. So this is from Herbivore Farm, which is in the city limits of Kansas City, Missouri. So you can see here. Where they use a high residue system. You can see how much mulch. So this is after a crop. You can see how much mulch is left on the soil there. But you can tell they actually put that cover crop in You know, it's you can still cover crop with these systems. You can tell it was actually done by hand because you can see their little where the cover crop wiggles a little bit. It doesn't, all the rows don't wiggle together. So you know, I haven't talked too much about cover cropping just because we don't have the time, but you know, some it's an interesting thing. Some no-tillers, a lot of no-tillers that I talk to actually don't cover crop because some of them are growing year round and they see the cover, their cash crop almost like a cover crop, in that they try to keep a cash crop in the year in the ground all the time. Some no-tillers are big into cover crops, so it's not you know, it's not an either or proposition. You can do cover crops with no-till or not. So with these high residue systems, the way they tend to do it is like this, where they either need to direct seed or where they need to plant really tiny plants. They will, you know, the way that deep mulch method works is they just put a whole lot of mulch on the soil, whatever it is. You can see how much straw is on that soil. It will, you know, looks like there's enough straw there to suppress just about anything that wants to come up through. I mean, obviously it's not perfect, but then the tough part is like, okay, what if you need to direct seed something or transplant a really tiny transplant? Most of the direct mulches that I talk to, they will pull the mulch back. They basically make a furrow in the mulch, in possibly a furrow in the soil, depending on what they're planting. And then sometimes if it's a plant that's going to get a bigger canopy, they'll push it back up against the plant once it gets bigger. This is actually a picture of seed potatoes going in a high mulch system, and so you can see they just by hand made a furrow through those seed potatoes in there, and then they're going to cover them up and mulch them with straw or something like that. Here's just another picture of where they've made furrows to plant in a high residue system. Babies love it. So you can, so this is the reason I have this picture, is you can see this guy, they're planting, I think, tomatoes or cucumbers or something like that. And so all he's doing, so you can see, it's kind of hard to see, but he's got tapes on the soil there. So that, because you don't have a grid or something laid out, you can't really even see the soil in the system, right? So he put down tapes to show him how to make a straight line, and then he's just looking on the tape and just putting this, you know, sinking the trowel in there and throwing a plant in there wherever it needs to be, and then pushing the mulch up back around the plant so he doesn't get too much weed growth. You know, one of the things I love is it works in tight spaces. This is Seeds of Solidarity Farm in Massachusetts again, and so this guy Ricky, one of his signature things is to put down cardboard and then put down a layer of mulch. So like in this case, he would put down cardboard, put down a layer of mulch on top of that, like hay or something, to keep the cardboard from blowing away. And then, you know, he's got corn growing between the greenhouses. And I love this because I always thought that of the space between my greenhouses is kind of wasted space and I could never grow anything there. I tried it this past year, worked great. I just put down mulch. I made corn transplants just because I had a small area between greenhouses. Just put the corn, and I wanted the sweet corn earlier. So then I just poked it down through, and I had a great corn crop growing between my 2 high tunnels this year. So that's one of the things I love. You can do it's not dependent on getting a tractor in somewhere. You can just do it anywhere. And so here, Ricky's been doing this for many years. I don't know this. I think this spot he's been doing for more than 10 years, maybe almost 20. So what he's showing me is that he can sink. He just pulls back the cardboard in the mulch, and he can sink his arm in up to the elbow, because he's been, instead of digging down, he's one of those people who's been building up soil. So he's been doing it for so long. He has all this soil that he's built on top of the naturally occurring soil layer. It's really fluffy. He can just stick his arm right down in there. So here we're kind of deconstructing it. You can see all the cardboard. And so, yeah, so his method would be, I would say he's interesting because he's so into the cardboard, because with the larger plants, what he does is layer of cardboard, layer of straw on top of the cardboard, and then he punches a transplant down through it. And then for smaller crops like salad mix or something like that would be direct seeded, he takes kind of the opposite approach, where he can even, go on sod, where he'll put cardboard on the sod and then put compost on the cardboard and then direct seed, or I guess you could transplant a small transplant like a lettuce or something like that. So you basically just have layers. You have compost on top, you have the cardboard that's suppressing weeds from coming up from below, and then you just plant or transplant into the compost sitting on top of the cardboard. So it's a way, he calls them, I think he calls them Insta gardens, because you can just go, you can pretty much go from sod, just plant right on the sod, because the cardboard will suppress the grass. So these are just some pictures from no-till farms, and I think we should wrap it up. Oh yeah, this is one thing. So one thing that a lot of no-tillers do use is, this is a tilther, which I believe was designed by Elliot Coleman, and so it's just a tilther is almost like a mini rototiller, but it only does about the top inch or 3/4 of an inch of the soil, and so it doesn't have the tillage properties like a rototiller would. It just fluffs up the top inch or so of the soil enough to incorporate some fertilizer, as you can see, incorporates fertilizer, and then gives you enough loose soil to direct seed into. And so these are the beds at Bear Mountain Farm in Oregon. And so, a lot of the no-till methods do involve compost, which can be painstaking. But these guys, this is Frith Farm here in Maine, and they make it into kind of a game. They have 3 people with wheelbarrows, and one person drives the tractor, and they race, and they see if all the people can get their wheelbarrows down of compost on the beds before the tractor comes back. And once again, cover cropping. So this is Frith Farm in Maine again. Danny Mays, he just wrote a really nice no-till book. I forget exactly what it is, but it's got no-till in the title. So all these people, definitely worthwhile reading about the different methods. So he's really into cover cropping in his no-till system. So he just plants these cover crops with an earthway seeder, and then the way he terminates them without tarping or without tillage is this is a flail mower on the front of the BCS. And so actually I did notice somebody asked in the question about mowers. I would say the go-to thing for a no-till would be a flail mower, because flail mowers, they kind of chop and drop. Okay. So I don't know if you know a flail mower, instead of a rotary mower where the blade goes around and around, in a flail mower, it's a rotating drum that has all these little knives or hammers on it, and it just almost like liquidate. So as you drive it over a crop, it almost liquidates a crop, and so it chops it up into tiny pieces and it drops it straight down, because you don't have the rotary blade blowing it around. So you could do the same thing with a lawnmower with a bag that doesn't have a bag on it, or a bush hog or something like that. But flail mowers are really great for no-till. Oh, and here's just a few pictures from my own farm. So we've done a lot of experiments in the hoop houses and in the field, but this is for the last 2 years we grew a 1/4 acre of hemp, and so we wanted to get a whole 1/4 acre ready at the same time. And so this is from my own farm. This is what I said. This was not enough, so these tarps blew around a lot, and so I came back 2 or 3 more times and just put more stuff down on these fields. The interesting thing is that, so they had this is the after so I had both solarization and occultation going on at the same time. They both worked really well. It's just, the solarization worked faster because it got hotter. And what I did is because it was the field that we are conditioning was pretty much sod. After solarizing, I just used this shank on my tractor to cut, because we planted the hemp on 5-foot centers. So I just went straight down each bed and just scored the bed, because I don't know that I even needed to do this. I probably could have skipped it, but I was worried that the hemp wouldn't be able to get tap rooted as well. So here, this is what I was doing, is I just ripped right the center of each bed after it had been solarized and occultated. And you can see there's a green patch right there. That's where a tarp was blowing up and the weed control wasn't as good. And then, so on my own, this is my own farm again. What we did after I ripped those beds, I used a manure spreader, and I disengaged the beaters at the back, because the beaters tend to fling compost around, and what I really want is a compost dropper, but I don't have one. So I use the manure spreader with the beaters disengaged to drop probably about 4 inches of compost on all these beds. And then what we did is we had some old rotten round bales that we rolled out in the aisles. And so this is what our hemp field looked like. And it definitely wasn't perfect, but the weed control was really good. In fact, the most of the weeds that we had were from, there we go. Most of the weeds that we had were from some weeds that were in the compost. And so it worked really well for me. I've talked too long. Was trying to leave more time for questions. So I'll shut up. What do we have for questions?
Sure. Well, thank you, Andrew, for all of that great information.
Sure.
I've been kind of keeping track of chat. Are you okay, Andrew, with going a little bit over, and people, if they need to leave, they can leave? And
yeah, sure.
Or unless we're out of questions.
Yeah, I talk too much. It's my own fault. I can make up for it by staying a couple extra minutes later.
So one of the things that Haley brought up was just in regards to timing for tarping or solarization and occultation. Just for example, she overwintered rye cover crop, and just wants to know, like, how long should it be covered typically to really kill it off, which obviously changes with the temperature. But, you know, alongside of that, is there a time where you could potentially over solarize your crops? Can you leave the tarp on too long? So I guess kind of how long should it be on for at least, and then is there a time that's too long?
Yeah, sure. Good question. Most people say that for occultation, right? So the opaque tarps that just block the light, most people say for occultation, if you're trying to actually kill a cover crop, which if I got the name right, I think it was Haley, but if you have, let's say you've got rye, you've got a living rye cover crop that's out in your field right now, 4 weeks, I would plan on a 4-week minimum. But like I said before, the more the better, because I would say whenever the more the better, because the temperature and field conditions affect how quickly things die and how quickly they break down. Part of it is one of your goals. So if your goal is to kill the cover crop, but let's say you want residue, to a layer of mulch to plant into to continue to suppress weeds, I'd say go on the lighter side. So most of the people that I've talked to say that for most annuals, if you can tarp, a month of tarping will kill most annuals. And so I would say go on the lighter side of that if you want the cover crop to be dead. But if you want residue on the soil, a month or 6 weeks or something like that, I would say. If you want the cover crop to die and also break down, or you don't care, let's say you're doing a 2-step process, like you were gonna tarp and you needed to kill your cover crop, but we're gonna say put a layer of compost on top to plant into, I would say go put those tarps down right now, or like, I'm not kidding, like as soon as whenever, I don't know what your weather is, your field conditions are there, but it's the kind of thing I'd like to tell anybody. You're only going to get more busy as we head out of winter and into spring. You might, if you can, the longer you have that tarp down, the better the weed control will be. And so I'd say, if you don't care about the organic matter being there, do it the sooner the better, because that way, if something, if it doesn't work as fast as you think it might, the sooner you get it down, the better control you're going to have.
Sorry, I was muted. Next question. So JD brought up directly sowing seeds into thick mulch, and Jenna mentioned in the chat There's a lot of seeding ratios, especially Brian O'Hara mentions that in his book. And using like that broadcasting method for seeding ratios and compost and things like that. But it's complicated, right? So I don't know, can you give a broad overview about, like, for example, sowing carrot seeds into thick mulch?
Yeah, that's not something I've done a lot of, and so Brian's, I would say, everybody, if you're so Brian does a lot with as Becca mentioned, with he will I think he uses a earthway or something like that sometimes, but sometimes he does this really nifty thing where he hand broadcasts seed, because his point, which is a really good one, is that you can actually seed a lot of crops, like carrots, for example. Carrots, an individual carrot doesn't have that big of a footprint. So his point is that you can actually seed crops like carrots more densely than you can really plant them with a push seeder. Or I guess you could make a lot of passes with a push seeder, but he's really refined this, where that's one of the good things about his book, is he has all these seeding ratios in there where he tells you how much carrot seed, and it's really kind of an art. He's just gotten really good at essentially broadcast seeding, which a lot of people don't do anymore. Most people have gone over to mechanical seeding, but he gets these really beautiful, really dense stands of carrots that do well because, right, his soil health is good, right? So you got to think, if you're going to plant something really densely, you've got to have the nutrients from below to feed them. So his soil is in really good shape to feed a really dense planting of carrots. And then he's got these neat things where he does, in fact, okay, so I mean, this is one other thing to mention about that the seeding that Brian does, which is brilliant, is that he'll do, I believe what he does is he'll broadcast, he'll let's say solarize a bed, right, to kill the weeds, the remaining from the previous crop. He'll go out there and hand sow some carrots or some crops. And obviously he doesn't, this is where the devil's always in the details, right? And obviously some crops he transplants, some crops he hand sows, but he'll for those crops that he's hand sows, he'll actually go out there and basically sprinkle them on the bed, and then come with I think it's a mix of compost and or compost and wood chips or something like that, a combination to suppress, to both give the carrot something to sprout into, right? Because of course, seed to soil contact is really important for germination. And of course, if you're not churning the soil up, you kind of need to either do something like a drill that drills the seed, inserts the seed down into the soil, or alternately, you need to put some soil down over the top. So I think that's mostly what Brian's doing. But Brian's book is brilliant. It is, in fact, I got a copy lying around here somewhere, but it is his method is his book is definitely worth getting. And another nifty thing about Brian that as long as you got me on the topic, that some other growers talked about, but he, some of these growers that I talked to who have been doing no-till for longer periods of time, we're getting to the point where their organic matter levels were so high they didn't really need that much more compost, and their fertility was so high. And so one of the things Brian talks about doing is he has a ratio of what I think he calls it high carbon compost. If that's not the right name, that's basically what it is. So it's a compost where he makes compost with a higher ratio of leaves or wood chips or other carbonaceous materials than your normal thing. Like, there's all these recipes for compost out there, and a lot of them are pretty standard as far as like, this much nitrogen material, like manure or something like that, and this in another amount, a certain ratio of manure to carbonaceous materials like leaves and wood chips and stuff like that. And so he has this compost that he makes because for beds that there's enough fertility, but he just needs some organic matter, or he basically just needs, or maybe like those carrots, he's throwing the carrots out there and he just needs some organic matter to cover them up to get good germination. And so that's another nifty thing about Brian's book. And it may be, the recipe may be available other places, but it's definitely in his book of, because, you know, should we be so lucky, right, that we get to the point where we have so much organic matter and our fertility is so good, we need to be making low carbon compost, just to get some covering material there on the bed. So yeah, I definitely can't, back to the question, I don't know what the ratios are off the top of my head. I think that's where, you know, Brian's book is a great starting place, but it's also, you know, I think especially for something that's kind of an art, like hand seeding a bed, I think Brian's book, and he's really sharing, you know, there's a lot, he's got a lot of materials. Like if you look up Brian O'Hara, you may be able to find other useful things online or somewhere. But I think that his ratios of like how many seeds to use for hand seeding a bed will get you started. And then it's the kind of thing that you'll refine, since it is a little bit of an art, like how much you know, and I figure everybody, if you're hand seeding, you know, everybody's going to do it a little different. So I think he's going to get you in the ballpark, and then you've got to figure out exactly what works for your own system.
Yeah, definitely. I know that hand seeding method was something that I got to practice at a former farm, and sometimes it was like, oh, 70% germination. Other times it was like, oh, 30% germination. Got to work on that. So one last question, potentially, is dealing with pests like voles in a no-till situation. So I know a lot of us farmers have voles or small rodents that burrow into the ground, and, you know, covering them with a tarp doesn't really do much, and putting more mulch on top kind of gives them more of a habitat. So what's the no-till solution to dealing with voles besides having a really awesome little terrier that can dig them out?
Yeah, I wish I knew, and unfortunately, I wish I had a great silver bullet for voles. Unfortunately, yeah, voles kind of go along with that. They're kind of like slugs in that they, you know, they love little covered spaces. So I wish I had a silver bullet. I mean, we have a lot of cats, so on our farm, and I'm always amazed at the amount of carnage that they make, just because they leave. I guess because we feed them, they just leave us lots of little vole presents. So, but yeah, but we definitely struggle with it. I'm not, you know, and if anybody out there has a silver bullet for voles, please tell me. So, but yeah, so I would say cats and traps,
and Jonathan is mentioning encourage the owl population in your vicinity.
Owls, and probably just changing things up from time to time. Like I know when I've had tarps down in the greenhouse, you know, sometimes we pull them up and you can just see the little vole trails in there. And so, but that probably also, you know, probably just changing things up like that from time to time does also probably throws them for a loop, in that they, you know, they set up little habitats down there under the tarp, and then, you know, I figure then you pull them off and we try to let that cats have at them for a couple days before we move on to other stuff. But it's, yeah, seriously, voles, you know, voles and all those rodents are just a constant struggle, right? Because they want to be anywhere that's warm and has food, and that's what you're doing, you know, as a farmer. So unfortunately, there's no silver bullet. Although, the last thing I want to say on that, though, is that just so, you know, a lot of these systems may actually may get better over time. Like so once again, Singing Frogs Farm out in California, a lot of people know them. but they're, you know, I don't know, for some reason, they're just really brilliant. And a lot of the things they said to me tend to come back to me. Because one thing they said is that they had a lot of problems with, they have gophers, you know, so they have gophers, but they may have other rodents. And they said that one of the things that they realized, that there's two things they are doing that I think bear on this. And one thing is when they stop tilling, they realized a lot of their rodent predators, like snakes, have, you know, make burrows or use the burrows from other critters. And they realized that, you know, when you take a tiller through an area, you're wiping out, you might be wiping out the vole burrows or gophers, but they were going to remake them. Whereas if, you know, there's animals like snakes and some of the other snakes that they realized the two things they were doing was not tilling. They would leave, you know, if the snake had a burrow, they thought that was encouraging them. And they also started having hedgerows right alongside of their vegetables. And so they really thought that, I mean, in fact, I think there's a quote about this in the book, but they said that their gopher population was going down over time as they left the habitat, and they as far as not tilling, and then they encouraged habitat with the hedgerows and stuff like that. So I would say, you know, take farm planning kind of approach as far as you know, are there other things you can do, hedgerows and things like that. You know, you might get a little you might get more snakes by not tilling, but then, you know, are there other things you can do, like the edges of fields? Are there other unproductive parts of your farm that could be planted to perennials that you could cut, or even fruit trees or perennial flowers or anything like that, that will be a refuge for pollinators and predators and things like that, that may contribute to the overall, you know, control on your farm. So
cool. Well, Andrew, I just really, really wanted to thank you for being with us tonight. I thought the program was excellent. Thanks for staying a little extra to answer some of the questions. And for everybody who attended, we just wanted to thank you for coming, and just know that UConn Extension is always here to serve and help you acquire the knowledge that you really need to succeed in agriculture. So hopefully everyone wrote down some of the notes in the chat and some of the websites that we talked about and the books and all that. So again, thanks everybody for coming, and especially you, Andrew.
thanks so much for having me. It was my pleasure.
All right. Well, hopefully the snow will melt soon and we'll be in spring soon. All right.
One of these months.
Thank you, everybody.
All right, bye, everybody.